What secrets lie behind the king's bizarre and sudden actions? Will anyone survive this dark satire and deadly plague? Classic Storytime Hub presents King Pest by Edgar Allan Poe, a reimagined tale in English. Get ready to enter the world of King Pest, where mystery, dark humor, and horror intertwine in a story reimagined just for you.
Around midnight on an October night, during the daring reign of Edward III, two sailors from the trading schooner Free and Easy, then moored along the Thames, found themselves in a place that would seem utterly improbable to anyone else. They were seated in the cramped tap room of a London alehouse in St. Andrew's Parish, beneath the faded sign of a grinning sailor, the kind of place that promised warmth but delivered shadows. The room itself was a chaotic affair, low-beamed, smoke-darkened, and haphazardly arranged, with corners that seemed to swallow light and furniture alike. Yet, to the motley patrons scattered across its uneven floorboards, it was perfectly suited for the purpose of drinking, storytelling, and mischief. Among these ragged figures, the two sailors were certainly the most intriguing. The elder, taller of the pair, and known to his companion only as Legs, towered at a remarkable 6.5 feet. The height, however, forced him into a permanent stoop, his shoulders curving as if the weight of the world, or perhaps the weight of his own frame, pressed him down. Legs was all extremes. He was skeletal in his thinness, so that when drunk, his friends joked, he might serve as a pennon to top a mast, and sober, a makeshift jib boom. But such teasing never drew a smile from him. His face was a study in contrasts: high, sharp cheekbones, a hawk-like nose, a receding chin, and a fallen jaw gave him a look that was simultaneously absurd and intimidating. His enormous pale eyes protruded in a way that seemed to challenge anyone who dared meet them. Yet beneath the grotesque exterior lay a solemn, almost unshakable seriousness, an indifference to the trivialities of life that no jest or insult could ever touch. In that smoke-choked room, amidst the murmur of raucous sailors and the clink of ale mugs, Legs stood out, not just for his size, but for the eerie gravity that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. The younger sailor was a study in contrasts to his towering companion. No taller than 4 feet, he stood squat and oddly cumbersome, his stumpy bow legs barely holding the weight of his rounded frame. His thick, short arms dangled at his sides like the flippers of some awkward sea creature, fists clenched, yet strangely useless. Small, nondescript eyes twinkled from deep within his rotund face, mostly hidden beneath the plump flesh that dominated every feature. His broad, purple cheeks were topped by a thick upper lip that rested upon an even thicker lower one, which he habitually licked with a self-satisfied air that hinted at a strange, quiet confidence. He regarded Legs with a mixture of awe and amusement, occasionally tilting his head upward as if he were watching the sun set against the rugged peaks of some distant mountain. Only the mountain, in this case, was Legs' impossibly long, stooped figure. Their night had already been a long one, wandering from one alehouse to the next, testing the patience and resources of their purses. Even the stoutest pockets have their limits, and by the time they stumbled into the current inn, their coins were gone, leaving them with little more than appetite, curiosity, and the hope of a warm corner to rest.
Now the story truly begins. Legs and his companion Hugh Tarpaulin rested both elbows on a broad oaken table, each supporting a cheek with a calloused hand. Between them sat a massive, unpaid-for flagon of ale, their prize and shield from the night's chill. Their eyes, however, were drawn to a curious and ominous inscription over the doorway: "No chalk."
The words, scored with chalk in spite of their bold declaration against it, were enough to spark indignation in the seamen. Neither had much skill in reading. Letters, after all, were arcane symbols to many a common sailor of the time, but there was something about the way the message leaned and twisted across the doorframe, a subtle, unsettling imbalance that seemed to foretell trouble. Legs, squinting with solemn resolve, finally broke the silence. "Looks like dirty weather ahead, Hugh," he muttered. "Best pump ship, haul all sail, and run with the wind while we can." And with that, a tension hung over the table, mingling with smoke, shadow, and the heavy scent of ale, a prelude to the strange and unpredictable night that was about to unfold. With their flagon emptied and the hems of their short doublets tucked up for speed, Legs and Hugh Tarpaulin made a break for the street. Tarpaulin, in true chaotic fashion, tripped twice over the fireplace, mistaking it for the door, but at last they burst into the night. By midnight, the two sailors were already in full flight, hearts racing, sprinting down a shadowy alley towards St. Andrew's Stair, with the furious landlady of the Jolly Tar in hot pursuit. Mischief and trouble had found them. This was a London of fear and whispers. Across England, and most vividly in the capital, the word plague had become a constant, terrifying refrain. Entire districts had emptied as if the city itself had fled. Along the dark, narrow, and filth-choked lanes near the Thames, the demon of disease was said to roam, and only awe, terror, and superstition stalked the streets. By royal decree, these regions were quarantined. No one dared enter under penalty of death. Massive barricades blocked the alleys, guards patrolled the thresholds, and yet, even under the shadow of near-certain doom, thieves still ventured into the empty houses. Night after night, these empty homes were stripped bare. Anything of value, iron, brass, lead, vanished, carried away by unseen hands. And every winter, when the gates were reopened, it became obvious that no lock, bolt, or secret cellar could truly protect the treasures left behind. Wine, spirits, and valuables that merchants had trusted to survive the plague were routinely found gone, spirited off in daring raids, leaving only the echo of their absence in the silent, disease-haunted streets. Few of the terrified citizens imagined that human hands were behind these nightly thefts. Instead, whispers spoke of pest spirits, plague goblins, and fever demons, mischievous little imps blamed for the chaos. Tales so chilling were repeated hour by hour that the forbidden district seemed to shiver under a shroud of dread. Even the boldest thieves were often scared off by the horrors their own imaginations conjured, leaving the empty streets to nothing but silence, gloom, pestilence, and death. It was at one of the dreadful barriers marking the pest ban that Legs and Hugh Tarpaulin found themselves trapped while scrambling down a narrow alley. Turning back was impossible, and time was short. The landlady's shouts were close behind. Yet for seasoned seamen, climbing over rough planks was child's play. Fueled by the twin excitements of fear and drink, they hurled themselves over the barrier, shouting and laughing like men possessed, and soon became lost in the labyrinth of foul, twisting alleys. Had sobriety held sway over them, their nerves would have shattered. Cold, misty air clung to the streets. Paving stones jutted chaotically from the ground, tangled with tall, rank grass wrapping around their ankles. Collapsed houses blocked the paths, and everywhere hung the stench of decay. Even in the dim, eerie light that seemed to leak from the very mist itself, shadows revealed a grim sight. In the alleys, behind collapsed walls or within shuttered windowless homes, lay the corpses of other midnight scavengers, men and women claimed by the plague in the midst of their own daring thefts. The city's dark heart had a life of its own, and Legs and Hugh had stumbled straight into it, drunk, reckless, and utterly unaware of the terror awaiting in every corner. Yet nothing, neither shadows nor eerie sounds, nor the twisted debris of the plague-ridden streets, could slow men like Legs and Hugh Tarpaulin. Brave by nature, and further fueled by the potent warmth of their ale, they pressed on, staggering forward as straight as drunken courage would allow, utterly undaunted by the jaws of death that seemed to gape at every corner. Legs led the way, his long, gangly frame cutting through the gloom, letting out a series of wild yells that echoed off the crumbling walls like the war cry of some phantom warrior. Behind him, the squat and roly-poly Tarpaulin clung desperately to his companion's doublet, his own voice booming from deep within his chest in a basso roar that rivaled the thunder itself. They had clearly entered the heart of the plague's dominion. Every step grew more treacherous, the paths narrower, the air fouler. Decaying beams and massive stones fell sporadically from the towering ruins above, each crash a grim reminder of the height and fragility of the surrounding buildings. Forced to scramble over heaps of rubble, they occasionally found their hands brushing against skeletal remains, or worse, bodies still fleshy yet lifeless, claiming the streets as their final resting place. Then, as they stumbled against the doorway of a tall, ominous building, Legs let out a shrill, piercing yell, a challenge, a warning, a taunt all at once. From inside came a terrifying reply, a rapid succession of wild, fiendish shrieks, laughter twisted into something unnatural, something inhuman. But fear had no hold on these drunken men. Fueled by sheer recklessness and ale, they barreled forward, crashing the door open with a cursing roar, stumbling into the heart of the horrors within.
The door swung open, and Legs and Hugh staggered into a scene stranger than any nightmare. They had crashed into what appeared to be an undertaker's shop, though a corner trapdoor hinted at something more sinister, a spiral of wine cellars below, where the occasional crash of breaking bottles revealed that the stash was far from empty. At the center of the room stood a table, and rising from its middle was a massive tub of punch, steam curling from its depths as if the brew had a life of its own. Bottles of wine, cordials, jugs, pitchers, and flagons were strewn about, scattered with chaotic abandon, as though the room itself had been overtaken by revelry. Around the table, perched on coffin-like trestles, sat a company of 6 figures, each more grotesque and uncanny than the last. Front and center, slightly elevated above the others, sat the apparent master of this macabre gathering. His frame was tall and skeletal, yet even Legs felt dwarfed by the gaunt extremity of his emaciation. His skin was the color of saffron, stretched taut over a ghastly visage, dominated by one horrifying feature, a forehead so unnaturally high that it seemed as though a crown of flesh had been grafted atop his head. His mouth puckered into a strange, ghastly grin, dimples accentuating an almost mocking friendliness, while his eyes were glazed and opaque with the fumes of drink. He was draped from head to toe in a richly embroidered black silk velvet cloak, worn carelessly like a Spanish gentleman fallen into madness. From his head sprouted sable hearse plumes that nodded with eerie, jaunty motion as he surveyed the table. In his right hand, he brandished a human thigh bone, swinging it with theatrical force, sending imaginary companions reeling with each ceremonial knock. Opposite him, with her back to the door, sat a lady equally remarkable, though in a different, equally unsettling way. Even from their drunken vantage, Legs and Hugh could tell that the room's occupants were far from ordinary, each a living caricature of revelry and horror, as though the plague itself had conspired to gather the strangest souls in one room. Although she stood as tall as the ghastly president, the lady had little reason to complain about his extreme emaciation. Herself was unmistakably in the final stages of a dropsical affliction, her body swollen and grotesque, echoing the massive puncheon of October beer resting nearby, its head caved in like a forgotten relic of some drunken festival. Her face was round, flushed a deep red, and full to the point of absurdity, but like the president, only one feature demanded attention. In her case, it was the mouth. From one ear to the other it stretched in a cavernous chasm, constantly disturbed by the bobbing of her short, ornate earrings. She struggled valiantly to keep it closed, striving for an air of dignity, dressed in a freshly starched and ironed shroud that hugged her throat, finished with a delicate crimpled ruffle of cambric muslin. At her right sat a delicate young lady, clearly under her patronage. Tiny and fragile, her fingers trembled, her lips were livid, and a faint fiery spot marked her otherwise leaden complexion, a clear sign of a ravenous consumption racing through her veins. Yet she carried herself with an air of refined elegance, draped in a flowing winding sheet of the finest Indian lawn, her hair cascading in gentle ringlets over her neck. A soft, almost innocent smile hovered on her lips, but her nose, a long, thin, serpentine appendage, pockmarked and grotesque, hung far below her mouth. Despite her attempts to shift it aside with delicate motions of her tongue, it lent her face a peculiar, almost uncanny expression, hinting at both fragility and a subtle mischief beneath her genteel exterior. In that strange, death-haunted chamber, Legs and Hugh could hardly take in the scene before them, a grotesque court of the diseased and the debauched, a tableau where plague, decay, and delirious revelry all mingled in terrifying harmony.
Opposite the delicate young lady, and to the left of the bloated dropsical matron, sat a small, puffy, wheezing old man, his face resting on his shoulders like a pair of swollen wine bladders. One bandaged leg was casually propped upon the table, his folded arms signaling a self-imposed authority. He seemed to take immense pride in his appearance, especially in his gaudy, jewel-toned surtout, fashioned from a richly embroidered silk cover that once adorned some noble family's coat of arms. The expensive tailoring clung perfectly to his rotund form, as if the man himself were a relic of vanished aristocracy. To the right of the president sat another curious figure, a gentleman clad in long white hose and cotton drawers, trembling in what Hugh Tarpaulin immediately dubbed the horrors. His freshly shaved jaw was tightly bound with muslin, and his wrists were similarly restrained, preventing him from indulging too freely in the table's chaotic spread of liquor. Yet despite these precautions, his enormous ears jutted upward like sails, twitching at every cork popped or bottle uncorked, as though they had minds of their own. Finally, fronting the table, a sixth figure completed the bizarre assembly, a stiff, awkward man, paralyzed and painfully constrained, dressed in the most unusual of garments, a polished, new mahogany coffin. Even in this impossible attire, he somehow conveyed an air of tragic dignity, a living monument to the macabre revelry around him. Together, these six grotesque figures formed a tableau both terrifying and absurd, a court of decay, drunkenness, and death, each member exaggerated in some singular way, as if the plague itself had sculpted them into a grim parody of life. Legs and Hugh, intoxicated and fearless, could only gape in bewildered awe, caught between horror and fascination as they stumbled deeper into this nightmarish feast. The coffin-wearer's hood pressed tightly over his skull, draping his head like a sinister hood, giving his face an eerie, almost hypnotic presence. Armholes had been cut into the sides, not so much for elegance as for some twisted convenience, but still he could not sit upright like the others. Reclining at a 45-degree angle against his trestle, his enormous goggle-like eyes rolled upward in sheer astonishment at their own ghastly size. Before each of the grotesque party sat a portion of a human skull, repurposed as a drinking cup. Above them, a full skeleton swung from the ceiling, tied by one leg to a rope fastened into a hook. Its other limb flailed freely, causing the rattling frame to twist and spin with every gust of wind sneaking through the room. Charcoal burned in its cranium, casting a fitful, flickering light that danced across the walls, illuminating coffins, piles of undertakers' wares, and the darkened windows that kept the outside world at bay. The scene was both macabre and mesmerizing, a room alive with decay and chaos. Legs and Hugh, however, were far from composed. Legs, leaning against a wall, let his jaw drop even lower than usual, his eyes widening to their maximum, as though his brain were struggling to process the absurdity before him. Hugh Tarpaulin, stooping until his nose nearly touched the table, palms splayed upon his knees, erupted in a loud, shameless, and completely inappropriate fit of laughter, his mirth echoing off the dark walls, mingling with the flickering light and the swaying skeleton above. Even in the midst of horror and decay, their human instinct for chaos and for ridiculous delight refused to be silenced. The night, it seemed, had only begun.
Yet, despite the raucous and utterly rude entrance of Legs and Hugh, the tall, gaunt president of the table smiled graciously upon them. His plume-laden head bobbed in a dignified nod as he rose, taking each sailor by the arm and guiding them to seats that had been hastily arranged for their convenience. Legs complied without a murmur, sliding into place with the stoic patience of a seasoned seaman. Hugh Tarpaulin, on the other hand, found a more whimsical option. He dragged his coffin trestle across the table to the side of the frail young lady in the winding sheet, plopped down beside her, and poured a skull full of red wine, raising it in a reckless toast to their new, bizarre companions. The stiff man in the coffin bristled at the audacity, his rigid form trembling with indignation, but before any true quarrel could break out, the president rap-tapped his human thigh-bone against the table, demanding attention. "It becomes our duty upon this most felicitous occasion," he began. "Avast there," interrupted Legs, his expression suddenly serious. "Avast a bit, and tell us who in blazes ye all are. What business have ye here rigged off like foul fiends, swilling the snug blue ruin stowed for the winter by my honest shipmate, Will Wimble the undertaker?" The room erupted. Every grotesque member of the assembly half leapt from their trestles, letting out a rapid volley of shrieks and fiendish laughter that would have frozen the heart of any sober soul. Yet the president alone retained his composure. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward Legs with an air of regal authority and continued, "Most willingly will we satisfy any reasonable curiosity of guests so illustrious, unbidden though they may be. Know then that within these dominions I am sovereign, and here I reign with absolute authority, under the title of King Pest the First. This chamber," the tall, gaunt president intoned, "which you no doubt blasphemously imagine to be the humble shop of Will Wimble the undertaker, a man unknown to us, whose plebeian name has never before this night offended our royal ears, this very room is the dais chamber of our kingdom, consecrated to the counsels and sacred business of our kingdom, and to purposes lofty beyond your mortal comprehension. The noble lady opposite you," he continued, gesturing with a sweeping hand, "is Queen Pest, our serene consort. The other exalted personages you behold are members of our illustrious family, each adorned with the insignia of the royal bloodline. His Grace the Archduke Pestiferous, His Grace the Duke Pestilential, His Grace the Duke Tempest, and Her Serene Highness the Archduchess Anapest. Legs and Hugh blinked in stupefied awe, but the president went on, unruffled by their incredulity. As to your inquiry concerning the purpose of our council, we might justifiably say that it concerns ourselves alone, and is of no import to any other. Yet, in deference to your rights as unbidden guests, we will further explain. Tonight, we are here, through deep research and meticulous investigation, to explore, analyze, and ascertain the undefinable spirit, the ineffable nature of the inestimable treasures of the palate, the wines, ales, and liqueurs of this goodly metropolis. By such examination, we advance not merely our own designs, but the interests of that unearthly sovereign who reigns us all, whose dominions know no limit, and whose name is Death. "Whose name is Davy Jones!" shouted Hugh Tarpaulin, helping the frail young lady beside him to a scull of liqueur and pouring a second for himself, his voice bouncing off the darkened walls as if daring the very shadows to object.
"Profane varlet," thundered the president, turning his piercing gaze toward Hugh. "Profane and execrable wretch! We have, in consideration of those rights which even thy filthy person cannot forfeit, deigned to answer thy rude and unseasonable inquiries. Yet, for thy unhallowed intrusion into our councils, it is our royal will that each of you be mulcted in a gallon of blackstrap, imbibed in a single draught, upon your bended knees, and in honor of the prosperity of our kingdom. Only then shall ye be free to depart, or remain and partake of the privileges of our table as your own inclinations dictate." Legs, though thoroughly astonished, felt a flicker of respect, or perhaps awe, for the commanding presence of King Pest the First. Rising and steadying himself against the table, he spoke with as much dignity as his seafaring lungs could muster. "It would be utterly impossible, Your Majesty," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Even a quarter of such liquor could not be stowed in my hold, not to mention the ballast I shipped this very morning, or the various ales and liqueurs collected tonight at different ports. My cargo is already full of humming stuff duly purchased and secured at the sign of the Jolly Tar. I pray, therefore, that your Majesty take the will for the deed, for by no means can I, nor will I, swallow another drop, least of all of that villainous bilge-water which you dare call blackstrap." The chamber fell silent for a moment, the only sounds the distant clatter of the swaying skeleton above, and the faint hiss of the flickering charcoal light. Even King Pest himself paused, perhaps impressed, or at least intrigued by the stubborn audacity of the seaman before him. "Belay that," interrupted Hugh Tarpaulin, astonished not so much by the length of Legs's speech as by the boldness of his refusal. "Belay that, you lubber, and Legs, none of your palaver. My hull's still light, though I must admit you seem a bit top-heavy. And as for your share of the cargo, well, rather than raise a squall, I'd find a place for it myself, but—" "This proceeding," interjected the tall, gaunt president, his voice as sharp as a marlinspike, "is not to be altered or recalled. The sentence of the mulct is median in nature, and must be carried out to the letter without hesitation. Should you fail, we decree that you be tied neck and heels and drowned as rebels in yonder hogshead of October beer." "A sentence! A sentence! A righteous and just sentence! A glorious decree! A most worthy and upright condemnation!" shouted the entire Pest family in unison. The king wrinkled his forehead into innumerable furrows. The gouty little man puffed like a pair of bellows. The lady in the winding sheet waved her long curved nose with dramatic flair. The gentleman in cotton drawers pricked up his ears at the pronouncement.
The woman in the shroud gasped like a dying fish, and the coffin-bound stiff man rolled his eyes in rigid horror. Unfazed, Hugh Tarpaulin chuckled, ignoring the chaos around him. "Oh, oh, 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 oh." I was saying when Mr. King Pest poked in his marlinspike that 2 or 3 extra gallons of blackstrap would be no trouble for a tight little sea-boat like me, but to drink to the health of the devil, may God forgive him, and go down on my marrow bones to that ill-favored majesty, whom I know as well as I know myself to be a sinner, to be nobody in the whole world but Tim Hurlygurly the stage player. Why, that's an entirely different matter, and utterly beyond my comprehension."
Legs's words had barely left his lips when the chamber erupted in chaos. At the name Tim Hurlygurly, the entire grotesque assembly leapt from their trestles as if struck by invisible lightning. "Treason!" roared King Pest the First. "Treason!" wheezed the gout-ridden little man. "Treason!" shrieked the Archduchess Anna Pest. "Treason!" muttered the jaw-bound gentleman. "Treason!" growled the stiff occupant of the coffin. "Treason! Treason!" howled the queen of the cavernous mouth. Before Hugh Tarpaulin could even react, she grabbed him by the back of his breeches, lifted him high into the air, and dumped him head first into the enormous puncheon of ale. For a few wild seconds he bobbed like an apple in a frothing bowl, until at last he disappeared into the whirlpool of foam, which his frantic struggles had churned into a frothy maelstrom. But Legs was far from cowed. With a roar of defiance, he shoved King Pest through the open trap-door, slammed it behind him with a curse, and stormed to the center of the room. His fury was unstoppable. Grabbing the skeleton swinging above the table, he smashed it down with merciless force, scattering bones like confetti, and with one final brutal swing, struck the gouty little man senseless. Then, with a roar that shook the chamber, Legs charged the fatal hogshead of October ale, already holding the trapped Hugh. With Herculean strength, he rolled it over and over, churning the frothy, effervescent brew into a turbulent sea, while the shouts, shrieks, and clattering of the plague court echoed in the shadows. The chamber had become a maelstrom of chaos, horror, and grotesque comedy, a place where only sheer courage or sheer madness could prevail. Suddenly, a torrent of liquor exploded with unrelenting force, fierce, impetuous, and unstoppable, flooding the room from wall to wall. The heavy table toppled with a crash, trestles flew into the air, the tub of punch plunged into the fireplace, and the ladies screamed into hysterics. Piles of deathly furniture tumbled and collided, while jugs, pitchers, and carboys careened wildly, mingling in chaos. Wicker flagons smashed desperately against bottles of cheap liquor, creating a cacophony of shattering glass and splashing liquid. The man afflicted with the horrors was drowned on the spot. The stiff, coffin-bound gentleman floated off helplessly, a macabre passenger atop the rolling waves of ale. But Legs, triumphant and unstoppable, grabbed the enormous lady in the shroud by the waist and charged straight for the street, her shrieks mingling with the crashing waves of liquor behind them. Hugh Tarpaulin, red-faced and puffing, followed close behind, sneezing and spluttering, while the Archduchess Anna Pest floundered after him, caught in the wild flood of her own palace. In a matter of moments, the chamber of King Pest had been utterly transformed into a maelstrom of liquor, chaos, and grotesque hilarity, a place where even death itself seemed to be drowned in the absurdity of the scene.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.